Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. On this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics, sport, and anything else we can think of. Now, today's guest is going to be talking to me about the issue regarding smoking, because the government, especially over the last year or so, have been talking about even restricting people's right to smoke even further. His name's Simon Clark, and he's here to talk about it now. Hello, Simon.
Hi, Chris.
Right there. So before we get into the crux of the discussion, because your discussion was based on Letter of Liberty you wrote for the Academy of Ideas on this subject. But before we get to the crux of it, can you just explain who you are and your journey as to how you got where you are now?
Yes, well, I'm director of the smokers lobby group Forest. Forest stands for Freedom Organisation for the Right to Enjoy Smoking Tobacco. And it was founded in 1979. So this year's going to be our 45th anniversary. And it was set up really in response to the launch of Action on Smoking and Health, which was launched in 1972. And of course, the purpose of ASH is basically to try and get people to stop smoking. But more than that, they ultimately want to ban the sale of tobacco completely. And our position has always been that we're not in favor of smoking. We don't encourage people to smoke. We accept that there are serious health risks associated with smoking. We don't shy away from that at all. But what we believe is that once you're an adult, once you're 18 years old, it's up to you to, make decisions in your life about smoking, drinking, doing all sorts of things. There's a lot of dangerous things out there that people choose to do. In some cases, they're dangerous sports. People play rugby, people box. As long as people do all these things in full knowledge of the potential risks, we think it's up to people to make up their own minds and not to have the government dictating how they live their lives. So I got involved in Forest actually a long, long time ago. I mean, I've been doing this job for over 20 years now. And I'm a non-smoker. I've never smoked apart from the odd cigarette, here and there, particularly when I was at school. But I'm basically a non-smoker. But I believe very strongly that smokers have been treated very badly over the last 20 years in particular. I mean, over the last 20 years, we've had a whole series of anti-smoking laws and regulations, beginning with the ban on tobacco advertising and sponsorship, which came in 2002. That didn't really bother most smokers, but what really did bother them and bothers them still today was the smoking ban, which bans smoking not just in the workplace, but in every single pub and private members club in the country. And of course, that included a lot of working men's clubs. And we know that the impact of the smoking ban on pubs and working men's clubs was devastating. I mean, there are other factors involved as well, including recessions and people's changing habits. But the impact, particularly on what used to call the old backstreet boozer, the urban pub that didn't have an outdoor space where people could go and smoke. Thousands of pubs closed. I mean, between 2007, when the smoking ban was introduced, and 2017, so in a decade, over 11,000 pubs in England and Wales closed. Now, as I say, it wasn't just down to the smoking ban. The smoking ban did have a serious impact, and of course, the closure of many pubs has had a big impact on local communities. Because if you live in an area where maybe the pub is the only sort of form of adult entertainment, if you like, then that's a serious issue for local communities. But since the smoking ban, we've had the display ban, which of course treats people like complete idiots, because it says, okay, if we hide cigarettes behind the counter or behind a door in shops, that'll stop people smoking. But it's not. It's had virtually no impact at all, because if people want to smoke, just hiding the packet out of sight is not going to stop them smoking. Likewise, with the introduction of plain packaging, the idea that you can put all these gory images and take away any branding from a packet and that will stop people smoking, it's just complete nonsense. And now, as you mentioned at the start, we've got the government planning to introduce a ban on the sale of tobacco to all future generations of adults. So as soon as you become 18, you will not be allowed to buy tobacco, which is really infantilizing future generations of adults. which is why we feel so strongly about it. But we see, as a country, we seem to be sleepwalking towards prohibition, because the reality is the vast majority of people in this country don't care. The majority are non-smokers, so it's not going to affect them. Obviously, it's not going to affect most existing smokers, because they will be allowed to continue smoking, although that may well change within a decade or so. And I say people are not really standing up for smokers because it doesn't affect them directly. But our argument is that it should interest non-smokers. It should interest anybody who's interested in individual freedom. Because if you don't stand up and support smokers today, eventually it'll be something that you enjoy doing that will be prohibited.
So just going back a little bit, you talked about the ban on smoking in public places. Wasn't that a good thing in regards to the secondhand smoke? In what ways was it specifically wrong? Because someone could argue that actually it was just not so much a ban on public places, but more of a ban in terms of where you could smoke. So, for instance, if you were in a pub, you could smoke in the pub, but you could still smoke outside it. So, if it stops people inhaling secondhand smoke, what specifically was the problem with it?
Well, the problem was, first of all, we weren't talking about public places. We're actually talking about private businesses. A pub, or a restaurant, they were all private businesses. And we believe that it was up to the owner of the business. He knew his customers best. He knew his staff best. If smoking was an issue on his property, then he was perfectly at liberty to ban smoking. And in fact, before the smoking ban came in, many restaurants had voluntarily banned smoking. So it was far less of an issue in restaurants. And I completely understand that as society changed and fewer people were smoking, I totally understand that non-smokers didn't want to be eating in a restaurant next to somebody who was smoking. But that we could have had a choice, because there were always going to be some restaurateurs. For example, our patron for many years has been the TV chef and restaurateur Anthony Worrell Thompson. Now, Anthony has owned lots of restaurants in his time. He had a restaurant in Notting Hill in West London that was on 2 floors. And long before the smoking ban came in, he allowed smoking on the upper floor and he banned smoking on the ground floor. So people had a choice. And the interesting thing was, he actually said he made more money from the floor where people were allowed to smoke, because smokers tended to stay longer, because obviously they were, smoking after their meal. And I think he found that they tended to buy more wine as well. They were drinking more. So he actually made more money from the smokers. But of course, I'm not saying it should just come down to money. It should simply come down to choice. Now, you mentioned passive smoking. I do think that um, I do think it's been a bit of a hoax, if I'm perfectly honest. The evidence about the risk of passive smoking to non-smokers does not stand up if you go into it in any detail. Now, there was a study published in 2003, which was one of the largest studies of its kind, and it looked at the impact on the spouses of smokers in America over a 50-year period from, I think, 1959 to 1999. So that would be a 40-year period. And it could find no significant element of risk of being exposed consistently to other people's tobacco smoke. Now, I'm not saying that it's pleasant to be exposed consistently to other people's tobacco smoke, but there's very little evidence of actual harm. I mean, there were a handful of court cases that went to court where employees would sue their employer for what they claimed was ill health as a result of being exposed to passive smoking. And not one court case in the UK actually won. They were all lost, because it's almost impossible to prove that ill health is caused by passive smoking. Now, the evidence simply did not justify a blanket ban on smoking in every single pub in the country. And when you think that smoking was also banned in private members' clubs, which included working men's clubs, but if you're a member of a private club, surely it's up to the members what their policy on smoking should be. And let's not forget, all of these pubs, restaurants, private clubs, they could all have had separate smoking rooms and well-ventilated smoking rooms. When I first started working at Forest, we had a small office in London. And I was amazed actually because my predecessor had installed in the office a number of air filtration units in the ceiling of the office. Now, at that time, about half the staff at Forest were smokers. And these air filtration units were absolutely amazing the way they could sort of suck the tobacco smoke out of the air so that you were simply not aware that people were smoking in that room. Now, again, pubs, restaurants, cafes, private clubs, they could all have been given the option of having separate, well-ventilated smoking rooms with these air filtration units installed. If they couldn't afford to install these air filtration units, well, they wouldn't have been allowed to have people smoking. But that technology could have solved the problem, but the big issue came down to choice, and there was no attempt to have any form of choice, because the problem with prohibitionists, they're never prepared to accept that there is a happy medium, that there should be some form of compromise. And we see this in so many areas, no attempt at compromise at all, because from the very beginning, this has not been about protecting bar workers or protecting people from the effects of passive smoking. It's all been about forcing people to give up smoking. And that's what we object to. It's this element of coercion that people know the health risks of smoking. If people choose to smoke in a free society, they are entitled to make so-called wrong decisions. And that's the whole point about living in a free society. We can make decisions that may not be good for us, but that's our choice. And, with the smoking ban, it just went way too far. We could have had a compromise. I mean, even before the smoking ban came in, under a previous Labour Health Secretary, John Reid, he was Health Secretary before the 2005 election. And Labour went into that election planning to compromise. They came up with an exemption to the smoking ban. They said pubs that don't serve food, in other words, what they call wet-led pubs, pubs that don't serve food but are basically there so you can go in and drink, they would have been given an exemption under the original Labour proposal. But after the 2005 election, even though it was in their election manifesto, and that's what people thought they were voting for, it was overruled in Parliament and a complete blanket ban was pushed through. So again, that's one of the reasons I'm a bit sort of cynical about politics these days, because, and it's not just smoking, I think we all know examples of political parties that have promised one thing in their election manifesto and then have simply overridden it once they're in power.
Why do you think smoking is treated differently in a way to, say, alcohol, where even though the advertising for alcohol has decreased and there's been legislation around that, you haven't seen some of the other elements in regards to alcohol, in regards to labeling, just having white labeling, especially when alcohol can cause, in a sense, a lot more injuries and deaths in some ways than smoking, not just because of, say, the cancers, but also the actions of people who have too much alcohol. Why do you think smoking has been more of a target?
Well, I think it's very simple. I think it's because the number of people who smoke has dropped dramatically over the last 50 years, and smokers are now in a relatively small minority. And when you're in a minority, you're an easy target for bullying. The reality is, most people in this country do drink alcohol, and therefore you're not likely to turn against something that you yourself enjoy doing. I mean, with smoking, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, I mean, the peak of smoking in this country was the 1950s, when 80% of men smoked and about 40% of women smoked. And since the 60s, that has been coming down. The most dramatic fall in smoking rates was actually between about 1975 and the early 90s, when smoking rates fell quite dramatically, I think from about 49% of the population to about 28 to 30%. And the reason for that fall, because in that period, late 70s, 80s, early 90s, there were still relatively few anti-smoking laws in place. the reason people stopped smoking or didn't take up smoking in the first place is because they were becoming aware of the serious health risks associated with smoking. If it actually, the risks of smoking have been known for a long, long time, even before the Second World War. Cigarettes were referred to by some people as coffin nails. But obviously the evidence of for example, the connection with lung cancer in particular, that became clear in the 50s and then the 60s. And therefore, by the early 70s, the health risks of smoking were becoming very, very clear. And purely on that basis, people were either not taking up smoking in the first place or they were giving it up. And again, our argument has always been that if people are properly educated about the health risks of all sorts of things, people can make up their own minds, and many people will choose not to take that risk. But again, it's up to them. Alcohol is completely a different issue. I still accept the evidence that smoking is probably a bigger risk than alcohol. But what I would say with smoking tobacco, is it's not a mind-altering substance. You can still carry on with your work perfectly capably. It doesn't, just because you might want to nip out from time to time and have a cigarette, or take nicotine, which is essentially what you're doing. It doesn't stop you doing your job. Where clearly, if you're drunk, that is going to prevent you from doing your work properly. And obviously, there are a lot of other drugs, illegal drugs, where there's no way you'll be able to do your job efficiently and properly if you're on the influence. Nicotine is a completely different drug. It's far more like caffeine, and the risk comes really from the inhalation of the smoke and the tar, which is, of course, one of the reasons why e-cigarettes have been so successful over the last 10, 12, 13 years an alternative to smoking. It's still a nicotine delivery system, but it doesn't involve the smoke and the tar, which is why a lot of smokers have chosen to switch. They still want to consume nicotine, but they want to do it in a much less risky way, and e-cigarettes has given them that opportunity. But again, we're already seeing with e-cigarettes, and this is going off on a slightly different issue, which you might want to come back to later, but of course, we're even seeing already that a lot of people who want to clamp down on vaping. They want to ban vaping in public places. They want to introduce all sorts of restrictions regarding the sale and marketing of e-cigarettes. There's talk at the moment of banning disposable vapes, when in fact, and also restricting the variety of flavors that are available. Now, this would be absolutely crazy thing to do, because the reality is that vaping has been, very effective as either as a quit smoking tool or a way of encouraging smokers to switch from something which is far more dangerous. But I mean, one other point I would really want to sort of make quite strongly is one of the reasons I defend smokers is because I know from personal experience of knowing many, many smokers over the years that a great many smokers do enjoy smoking. They get pleasure from it. And about 6, 7 years ago, we commissioned some research from an organisation in Glasgow called the Centre for Substance Use Research, who've done work for the Scottish Government, for the World Health Organization, for a lot of major governments and bodies. And they did a study for us where they surveyed over 600 what we'd call committed smokers, by which I mean smokers who are not looking to give up. And it was extraordinary. It was, as I say, this research was carried out by a third party, a reputable third party. And what they found was, of their sample of smokers, 95% said they smoked because they enjoyed it. They got pleasure from it. I mean, I think just over half accepted they were probably addicted, but they didn't mind. They didn't see that as a problem because, as far as they were concerned, the enjoyment and the pleasure they got from smoking outweighed what they perceived to be an addiction. And I do think the war on smoking over the last 20 years or so has actually been a war on pleasure, because people get pleasure in many, many different ways. And smoking for a great many people is a pleasure. I mean, somebody else we've worked with over the last 20 years from time to time is the artist David Hockney. Now, David Hockney spent a lot of his life, he currently lives in France, but he spent a lot of his life living in America, in California, and also in New York. And he's now 86. And he says of his generation, many people in his generation no longer smoked, but they were all on drugs like Prozac. And they took Prozac to basically calm them down. And he said that from his point of view, he gets a lot of pleasure from smoking, but it's also a way of calming him down. He says he doesn't take other drugs, but smoking and nicotine calm him down, and he gets a great deal of pleasure from that. And again, I don't know whether that's true or not, but he thinks it's true. And I'm not going to tell him, and I don't think government should be telling him that he's been doing the wrong thing for, throughout his lifetime. And he says he's now 86 years old. Who are we to tell people like David Hockney how they should get through life? And because one of our objections to bans on smoking on hospital grounds, for example, and a lot of people say to us, you're crazy. Why are you campaigning against bans on smoking on hospital grounds? Hospitals are places you go to get better. And we say, yes, of course, that's true. But also in the real world, a lot of people smoke for comfort. And hospitals can be very stressful places, not just for patients, but also for visitors who might be visiting relatives in hospital or are seriously ill. They're also stressful places for members of staff. If you go to any hospital, you'll often see, members of staff outside, including ambulance drivers, smoking cigarettes. They go out there for a bit of peace and a bit of comfort. They get comfort from smoking. And as I say, we get through our life in lots of different ways. Some people drink alcohol. Some people, consume nicotine. We all get through our life in different ways. And I don't think we should be dictating to anybody, how they get through their life. It's up to them, not the government.
So you talked about it at the beginning, and I started to do so. This bill regarding the restriction, even restricting smokers even more in terms of basically if they can smoke, and if so, where they can smoke, etc. Can you just go into the specifics of that bill and what the restrictions specifically are?
Yes, what we're expecting to be introduced in Parliament in the next few weeks is it's called the Tobacco and Vapes Bill. And I mean, first of all, it seems a bit odd to us to conflate tobacco and e-cigarettes in one bill, because although they're both nicotine delivery systems and both nicotine products, they are very, very different. And we accept that tobacco has a much higher risk, at least consuming tobacco, smoking tobacco has a much higher risk than vaping. So in our view, the two products should be completely separate and not conflated under one bill. The main purpose of, well, there are two main purposes of the bill. One is to ban the sale of tobacco, any tobacco product, to anybody born after 2008. So it means that when the bill might be introduced in the next few months, it won't actually be enforced until 2007. And the idea that anybody who is currently 14 will never be legally allowed to purchase tobacco in a shop. It won't ban anybody from smoking. Smoking will not be made illegal. What will be made illegal will be the sale of tobacco to anybody born after 2008. So, for example, back in 2007, I think it was, the legal age of sale of tobacco was raised from 16 to 18. And we thought that was perfectly reasonable because it brought tobacco into line with alcohol. Also, 18 is the legal age at which you are recognized as an adult. Now, bear in mind that at the age of 18, you've been able to drive a car for a year since you were 17. You've been able to join the army. I mean, at 18, you can be in the army and go around killing people. You're able to drive a car. You can purchase alcohol, all sorts of things. You can possess a credit card. At the age of 18, in the eyes of the law, you are an adult. And of course, you're allowed to vote as well. We believe it's perfectly reasonable to, once you're considered to be an adult, you should have the choice of whether or not to smoke, and therefore you should be allowed to purchase alcohol legally. Now, the idea that raising the age of sale, the way it's going to work is that the age of sale will rise by 1 year every year. So initially, they'll raise it so that you can't purchase tobacco if you're 19, then it'll be 20, then it'll be 21, then 22, 23, and so on. Now, as that happens, you're going to get some bizarre situations arising. So, for example, in about 10 years' time, you'll have a situation where a 25-year-old will be allowed to purchase tobacco, but a 24-year-old won't. And then another 10 years further on, a 35-year-old will be able to purchase tobacco, but the 34-year-old won't. Now, I suspect that long before that happens, people will realize that this is absolutely crazy. And it just makes a mockery of the whole thing. So I suspect long before that happens, the anti-smoking lobby will admit themselves, they will admit it's ridiculous that a 34-year-old won't be able to buy tobacco, but a 35-year-old will. And they'll say, look, the easiest, the fairest thing to do is to simply ban the sale of tobacco to any adult of any age. I mean, I have no doubt for 1 second that is exactly what will happen, because that's their long-term goal anyway. We know their goal is to essentially introduce prohibition for tobacco in the same way that alcohol was prohibited in the United States back in the 20s. Of course, the prohibition of alcohol didn't work because so many people drank alcohol in those days. It was never going to be possible to outlaw it completely. And so, of course, after I think it was 12 years, they had to repeal the prohibition of alcohol. With tobacco, it's going to be a little bit different because smoking is now a minority sort of activity. So fewer people smoke. And when you get fewer numbers, it is probably easier to legally prohibit something. But you're never going to stub it out completely. And the reason you're never going to be able to stub it out, a number of reasons. First and foremost, young people will always want to experiment. I mean, we see they experiment with illegal drugs. The idea that you can stop a 17 or 18-year-old or a 19-year-old from smoking tobacco um, isn't going to happen because 17, 18, 19-year-olds already getting access to illegal drugs and already experimenting with illegal drugs. So if they want to, nothing will stop them from smoking. What has stopped them smoking actually over the last 10, 15, 20 years is because smoking tobacco has gone out of fashion. That's the reality of it. I mean, the danger is if you raise the age of sale of tobacco to 19, 20, 21, and so on, you'll actually make the product more enticing to certain people. Because as soon as you prohibit something, it actually becomes like forbidden fruit. So in a strange sort of way, we could actually I don't think tobacco is ever going to come back into fashion the way it was in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. That simply isn't going to happen. But I think for people who might not have considered smoking, I think there's a big danger that this policy may make smoking tobacco rather more enticing and rather more attractive. The other issue, of course, is that when you introduce any form of prohibition, and I would call this creeping prohibition, because essentially you're prohibiting the sale of tobacco year by year to more and more people. So it's creeping prohibition. And as soon as you prohibit any substance, what always happens is you fuel the black market and you simply, I mean, the people who will be rubbing their hands with glee at the prospect of creeping prohibition of tobacco will be the criminal gangs, because at the moment, the uh, the from the terms of view or in terms of being caught and sentenced, the sentences for smuggling and selling illegal tobacco is much less than for smuggling and selling illegal drugs, for example. So criminal gangs will get involved in the sale of tobacco. And of course, they don't care about age restrictions. Criminal gangs will sell tobacco to whoever they want to, whatever age. So you could argue again that a policy like this is actually putting younger people more at risk because they won't be able to buy tobacco legally in shops, but there will be plenty of illegal tobacco available all over the country. So the idea that it's going to stop people who want to smoke of that age from smoking is nonsense. The other big thing in the tobacco and vapes bill we expect is going to be a ban on the sale of disposable vapes and restrictions on vape flavors. Now, the flavors issue is all to do with children vaping. And it's said that all these different flavors, some of which are meant to sound very enticing to children, it's said that we need to ban these flavors and some of the names that they come up with for some of the flavors because it entices children to smoke. The point is that flavors are not, in terms of attraction, flavors are not exclusive to children. I mean, it's like saying the only people who eat sweets are children. Now, this is clearly nonsense. Adults like sweets as well. Adults like sweet flavors. And vaping has been very successful in terms of getting a lot of adult smokers to switch to a far less risky product. So anything that discourages adults from switching from combustible tobacco to far less risky vaping, it surely has to be discouraged and is surely a stupid thing to do. Now, I think that there does seem to be an issue at the moment with children vaping. We hear a lot of stories from schools about kids vaping in the toilets, and some people seem to be getting addicted to nicotine. But the way to respond to that is not to ban flavors or certain flavors, and not to ban disposable vapes, which kids are getting their hands on. The proper response is to clamp down on those people who are selling e-cigarettes, including disposable vapes, to children. There is already a law in place. It is illegal to sell e-cigarettes to anybody under the age of 18. So what you do is you clamp down on people who are selling these things. And that's where the emphasis ought to be put. We don't need new laws. We already have a law in place that says it is illegal to sell e-cigarettes and disposable vapes to anybody under the age of 18. Well, enforce that law. Don't start bringing new laws, which are probably going to be even more difficult to enforce. Focus on existing laws. The thing about disposable vapes, apparently, again, there is an environmental issue with disposable vapes. Again, people tend to be sort of stupidly, in my view, dropping them rather than disposing of them properly. But people need to be helped in terms of disposing of vapes. We've seen with cigarette butts over the years that, again, I don't endorse people just dropping their cigarette butt on the on the ground where it has to be where it has to be swept up. But smokers need a bit more help, and over the years, cigarette bins have been removed by a lot of local councils. And the reason they do it is we don't want to encourage people to smoke. Well, they're having their cake and eat it, because on the one hand, they're taking away the cigarette bins, because they don't want to encourage people to smoke. Then they're complaining that people are dropping their cigarette butts. Well, it's crazy. And the same thing with disposable vapes. There need to be more places where people can dispose of their disposable vapes properly. I mean, already there are schemes in place that I believe that there is a scheme in place that any shop that sells you an e-cigarette, a disposable e-cigarette, single-use e-cigarette, has to take it back. You can go back to that shop and hand your vape back to them, and they've got to take it. Now, I don't think that is particularly well known by a lot of people, but there are schemes like that are out there, and those are the way. That's the way ahead, to have recycling schemes and encourage vapers to recycle their disposable vapes, not to actually ban a product that has been incredibly helpful in encourage them to quit to a safer product. And the original disposable vapes have actually been very successful. I mean, back 7, 8 years ago, they barely existed. And at that time, a lot of vapors were, walking around with these quite high-tech pieces of equipment that were actually a big turnoff to a lot of smokers, because there was a reason that the cigarette was so successful in the 20th century. I mean, if you start of the 20th century, there were a lot of people who smoked pipes. But to smoke a pipe, you had to walk around with a lot of equipment. Apart from the pipe itself, you had to have the tobacco, you had your pipe cleaner, you had to have your pockets were full of all this, all this stuff that you had to carry around with you. A cigarette, mass manufactured cigarette came along, and you literally just take it out of the packet, you set light to it, and you smoke it. It's so simple. And the problem with a lot of the e-cigarettes that were being used 6, 7, 8 years ago, and are still being used, but they're more of a niche market, is that they come along and they've got all these buttons and things, and you're expected to change the coil, and you're expected to change the flavors and so on. And it's so complicated to a lot of people, they're just not interested. So, of course, the disposable vape is so easy to use, just like a cigarette. It's far more attractive to a lot of people. So it's like any consumer product, you have to get large numbers of people using it to make it a mass, a mass product. It's got to be easy to use. The more complicated it is, the fewer people will use it. So sorry, I've gone off track a bit, but basically to answer your original question about the bill that's about to go through Parliament, two main issues in it are: one, raising the age of sale of tobacco, so it stops all future generations of adults from smoking, or at least from purchasing tobacco legally. And then there's an expectation, it's not been confirmed yet, but there's an expectation that it will include a ban on disposable vapes.
With Do you think that the bill reflects reality? And what I mean by that is, yes, we'll take alcohol as an example. You can't drink it till you're 18, but I can guarantee there's teachers who've actually, teenagers who actually tried it before they're 18. Same thing with smoking. I know you talk about the purchase of cigarettes, but I know a lot of people, for instance, they may know an adult or an older brother who can go into a shop and get it for them. I imagine, listening to what you just said there, it doesn't reflect the reality of the world, that just because you're a certain age doesn't mean you can't get someone to buy it for you and then smoke in your own home, for instance.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, that's why they brought in the proxy purchasing ban a few years ago, where they made it illegal for anybody, whether you're a relative or a friend. They made it illegal you can't go into a shop if you're 18, 19, 20 or older. In theory, you can't go into a shop, purchase any tobacco product, and then sell it on or give it to somebody who's under 18. That is illegal, and you can be prosecuted from it. I'm not aware of many prosecutions for proxy purchasing, because I think it's very difficult to actually prove that it's happened. And of course, that's why I was saying earlier that raising the age of sale to a situation where, it would be legal for a 25-year-old to smoke, or at least to purchase tobacco, but illegal for a 24-year-old to purchase tobacco. I mean, it's complete nonsense, because of course, once you get to that sort of age group, you're going to be, I mean, and younger as well, you're going to be going to parties, you're going to be some mingling with people who may be just a few months older than you, but they're allowed to purchase tobacco. And within a friendship group, you're going to be, swapping cigarettes amongst you. The idea that's going to stop people a few months younger, who are technically not permitted to purchase tobacco, is nonsense. As you say, with alcohol, people start experimenting with alcohol probably from 15, 16. Um, I mean, you simply can't stop it. I mean, funnily enough, I grew up in Scotland in the 70s, and it was interesting because back in the 70s, um, Scotland had a more of a Presbyterian approach to alcohol than England. And in those days, all the pubs in Scotland had frosted glass. And the idea was, if you were under 18, you couldn't look through the window of a pub and see people drinking. Likewise, in those days, adults were not allowed to walk outside the pub holding, a glass of beer or whatever, because again, it was all designed to stop what they call minors from being allowed to see people drink alcohol. Now, I mean, as a 15, 16-year-old, maybe even slightly younger. All it made me was determined to go into a pub because it made a pub so enticing, so attractive. I was desperate to get inside that pub and see what people were doing. And indeed, I went to school in St Andrews, and I remember when I was 15, there was one or two pubs in St Andrews. We all knew that we could go in and get served. So I was able to go into a pub at the age of 15 and get served in a pub. But subsequently, as a parent, I actually think, looking back at it, I think that was possibly the safest place to be as a 15, 16-year-old, because we didn't go into that pub to get drunk because we didn't want to stand out. We didn't want people to know that we were underage. So we kept quite quiet. We would sit in a corner quietly drinking. I'm absolutely sure that the barman, the people running the pub, knew that we were underage, but we weren't drunk. We weren't getting into any trouble. And actually, I think it was far better. Essentially, we were being supervised. I look at it like that. We were being supervised. Whereas I've heard a lot of stories since with my children's generation where kids meet up down the local park and they're knocking back booze in the park, where they're not supervised and they're not, and a lot more trouble is happening as a result of that. So my own view is that actually people under the age of 18 should be allowed to drink in a pub within reason, because actually they're being supervised, and we should have a much more adult approach to drinking in this country. I think the problem is by restricting it and banning it until banning the legal sale of alcohol until people are 18. Again, I think we're creating problems for ourselves in some ways. And any form of prohibition. Of course, that we have to be sensible in terms of alcohol and any of these other products, whether it's nicotine or whatever. But I think often the best people to make decisions are parents, not the government. And I think more responsibility should be put on parents' shoulders rather than expecting the government to make all these decisions for us.
There's a section in your of Liberty where you talk about the packaging and specifically about, I think it's women that would be more enticed to particular colours on the packaging. Which government minister's idea was it to think, oh, okay, well, if we take all the labelling off, all the designs off, packaging, then there'll be a decrease in the amount of people who smoke. And as an addendum to that, I don't know if they still do it. I mean, I've never smoked, but I remember there used to be these pictures on cigarette packets of the
Hmm.
effects of smoking. How effective has that been in turning people off the habit?
Well, starting with those, graphic health warnings were brought in, 15 years or so ago, I think. I can't remember the exact year that they came in. But the interesting thing with graphic health warnings, where you say, yeah, pictures of, pretty grotesque cancers, throat cancers, for example. Now, I think, yes, I think initially when they were brought in, they did have some initial impact. People looked at them and thought, Christ, these look pretty gory. But very, very quickly, it became like wallpaper. People, I think after the first few weeks, your senses become dull to these things. And what we've always noticed with smokers, it's never been about the packaging. It's always been about what's inside the packet, and what people want are the cigarettes. They don't really care. I mean, that's why actually a lot of smokers today don't care about what we call plain packaging or standardized packaging. They don't care about the grotesque images. I suspect that most of the time they don't even notice them because they say it's just like wallpaper. And I think we can say for certain that they're not that effective because um, the fact is, the government keeps having to change the images. Every few years, the images will be changed because, again, once people get used to the images, they just don't notice them anymore. So they have to introduce new images to try and shake people up again. But I think the other problem with some of the images that have been shown over the years is that they are so extreme. There's one that I particularly remember, which shows somebody with this horrendous cancerous growth on his throat. Now, I've never seen that I'm in my 60s. I've never seen that in practice. I'm not doubting for one second that some people, that people do get throat cancer, and there will be some people who've had terrible tumors like that. But it is so rare, it is so unusual that the vast majority of people have never seen it, never experienced it. And if you've never seen it, you're quite skeptical about it. You don't regard it as a serious risk. If it's not something you're exposed to in your life, apart from on a picture on a cigarette packet, why should you take it seriously? Now, another one, famously, is one of the images is a cigarette with droops at one end, and it's meant to represent impotence, a drooping penis. Now, again, the claim is, the threat is that smoking makes you impotent. But most people who know a little bit about the history of smoking know that the peak of smoking in this country was the 1950s. And what do we also know about the 1950s? There was a baby boom. Now, I'm not suggesting that smoking led to the baby boom. What I'm suggesting is that clearly, when 80% of the male population smoked in the 1950s, it can't have led to a heck of a lot of impotence because we had a baby boom. So, of course, people know that, and they think this is utterly ridiculous. So a lot of these type of, whether it's graphic images or a lot of the sort of scaremongering about smoking, I think often goes over people's heads because it's so extreme. Um, so, so I say, in terms of cigarette packets, and funny enough, actually, if you look at a lot of these anti-smoking laws that have been introduced over the last 20 years, you can, it's quite easy to work out whether or not they've had much impact, because you can chart the date that they were introduced. And obviously, you have to allow for a year or two for them to have some impact. And then you look at the smoking rates. And we can look at things like the introduction of graphic images. We can look at the introduction of plain packaging, which happened in 2016, 2017. And we can see that those measures had virtually no impact on smoking rates. Yes, smoking rates were coming down, but only in line with historical trends. Now, we can say the same thing about the introduction of the smoking ban in England in 2007, because before and after the smoking ban was introduced, smoking was falling, but after the introduction of the smoking ban, it continued to fall at the same rate that it was falling before the introduction of the smoking ban. So there was nothing about the smoking ban that suggested it had any impact on smoking rates whatsoever. I would say there were two things that have had an impact on smoking rates over the last 10, 12 years. One is the cost of tobacco smoking, cost of cigarettes. I mean, the tobacco duty has been put up to such an extent that I don't think it's not possible to deny that that has had some effect. Essentially, tobacco duty, the taxation on tobacco, has been used as a form of social engineering. It's been raised to such an extent that it's designed to force people, to coerce people to give up. But for every person who's given up smoking because it's just becoming too expensive, for every person who's given up, there's somebody else who said, I'm not going to give up. I'll simply buy my tobacco on the black market, where they can easily get hold of cigarettes for, less than half the retail price. Or else they might buy their tobacco abroad, countries like Spain, Germany, Poland, where they can get their tobacco for, again, far less than it's costing them in this country. So people will find their ways round that. And of course, the other thing that has been part of the reduction in smoking rates has been people switching to e-cigarettes. And there was a significant drop in the smoking rate between about 2012 and 2016. And that was directly, from all the statistics that are available, that was directly attributable to the rise in vaping between 2012 and 2016. So those are the only measures that have clearly contributed to a significant drop in smoking rates. All the other measures that have been introduced over the last 20 years, the ban on marketing and sponsorship or advertising and sponsorship of tobacco, the smoking ban, display ban, plain packaging, ban on tobacco vending machines, there is not a shred of evidence that they have had any significant impact at all. I mean, we thought the ban on menthol cigarettes that was imposed by the European Union, we thought that might have some impact because when the ban on menthol cigarettes was introduced, about 25% of the UK cigarette market was actually menthol cigarettes, which surprised me a bit that it was as much as that. But the UK had quite a high rate in terms of sale of menthol cigarettes. But again, there's no evidence that the ban on the sale of menthol cigarettes has had much impact. Overwhelmingly, smokers simply switched to ordinary cigarettes, non-menthol cigarettes. They didn't stop smoking.
With the pandemic, and I'm not sure if you have the figures in hand, was there a slight increase in smoking because people were being furloughed? There's not a lot to do, like I said, shots. So was there an increase in the number of people who were smoking, even if it's just something to do?
Mm. I mean, I've seen statistics that argue both ways. I mean, for example, early on, after the first lockdown, I seem to remember Action Smoking and Health, ASH, claimed that there were 1 million fewer smokers as a result of COVID, which would have brought the number of people smoking in this country down at the time from 7 million to 6 million. And that later turned out to be a load of nonsense. But at the time, they were saying it's because smokers were very concerned about getting COVID. This was obviously before the vaccine. And understandably, given the nature of COVID, if you were a smoker, I could understand people would be a bit concerned. But there was no real evidence that large numbers of smokers had quit. There were, as you say, that there were suggestions that smoking rates had crept up because there were fewer restrictions. People could smoke at home. They weren't smoking. They weren't in an office where they obviously weren't allowed to smoke. But at the same time, we know that a lot of people, because they were spending more time at home, where they might have children, for example, they weren't smoking because the children were around. So, to be honest, all the stats that I've seen, they vary enormously. I mean, the reality is that the smoking rates have continued to fall, even through COVID. The smoking rates that were announced a few months ago, which were for 2022, showed that smoking rates in England, I think, had come down to 12.9%, so almost 13%. And that was perhaps about 0.8 percentage points down from the year before. But it's always difficult to know. I think the big thing with smoking that we don't know is how many social smokers there are. Because our experience is that if you're a social smoker and you're asked in a survey, are you a smoker? You'll quite often say no. But we do know there are a lot of social smokers out there because, of course, as it's become more and more difficult to smoke at work, therefore, a lot of, the idea that all smokers are hopelessly addicted and can't go more than an hour or two without having a cigarette. That might be true of some people, but the vast majority of smokers are not like that at all. And many smokers can get through the day quite easily without having a cigarette. But when they go out in the evening, when they go go to the pub or they go out socializing, that's when they like to have a cigarette. And that's why even now, even though the number of smokers is down to 13% of the population, smoking areas outside pubs are very popular because the smokers are out there. Many of them are not, they're not smoking. They're not, I mean, if you go back 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was not uncommon for people to smoke 40 cigarettes a day, 2 packs, because they could afford to. Today, I don't know, there can't be that many people who can afford to smoke 40 cigarettes a day, not at the legal prices, because that's going to be costing them anything between 25 and 30 pounds a day. I mean, who could possibly afford that? Um, so there are a lot of social smokers out there, and in politics, people used to refer to people being shy conservatives. They wouldn't admit they were actually a conservative voter. And I think the same thing goes actually for a lot of smokers, because these days we hear it all the time that there are smokers who don't, quite often they don't want their family to know that they smoke, and they certainly don't want their employer to know they smoke. So they don't actually admit to being a smoker. But in a social situation, they do smoke. So it's difficult to know exactly where we stand with smoking rates, exactly how many people smoke. But I think it's pretty clear that smoking rates are continuing to fall. And the interesting thing is, as smoking rates continue to fall, we are getting down to what I'd call the hardcore smoker, um, alongside the social smoker. And the hardcore smoker is somebody who simply doesn't want to quit. For years, we've been told that 70% of smokers would quit if they could. I never believed that figure. I think it's one of these things. I don't smoke, but I'm overweight, and I know that I ought to lose weight for the sake of my health. But I don't want the government forcing me to lose weight. I don't want the government banning certain types of high processed food that's making me fat. I don't want the government forcing me to take, to take exercise every day. I don't want the government fat shaming me. If I cut down and I know exactly why I'm overweight, I eat too much and I don't take enough exercise. And I know that I'm an adult. I don't need the government telling me what I already know. And I certainly don't need the government forcing me to change my habits. And I think that's exactly the same is true of smokers. Smokers know the health risks, but many people continue to smoke because they enjoy it. And again, what our research has shown in the past is that quite often smokers will quit when they get a health scare. Understandably, you get a health scare and you think, shit, I better change my lifestyle. And that is what does force a lot of people to change their habits. And the same thing I'm true of my situation. I think if I have a serious health scare, I mean, my doctor is already telling me, oh, you ought to lose weight at your age. And, you could, if you don't lose weight, you could have a stroke in the next 10 years. I suspect, though, it will take something a little bit more serious than the doctor telling me that to actually make me change my sort of lifestyle. And that's just life. I mean, you were going back earlier, something you said earlier. Um, I mean, life's complicated and we all get through life in different ways, and none of us are perfect. And that's why I think the war on smoking is so wrong. I think, fine, educate people about the risks associated with smoking. That's absolutely fine. Equally, educate people about the risks of drinking alcohol to excess or eating the wrong type of food, if there is a wrong type of food. I mean, personally, I don't think there is a wrong type of food. You can eat too much of certain types of food, but if you don't eat things to excess, then eating to mod. I mean, when I was growing up, people used to say everything in moderation, nothing in excess.
Mm.
And I think that's how we should live our lives in a perfect world. In an imperfect world, obviously, a lot of people like me don't live our lives like that because I eat too much. Um, but if we just simply stick to that basic thing, everything in moderation, nothing in excess, I think that's quite a good credo around which people should live their lives. But we're not all going to be perfect. We're all going to be different. And one of the things in life these days, always I find quite strange, is we celebrate diversity at the moment, which is a perfectly, good thing to do. But diversity comes in all shapes and forms. And people who smoke, people who drink alcohol, people who are fat. We're all diverse in our own ways. Why do we want to create a society where we all live this perfect lifestyle? Do they think that we're all going to live to the same age? And also, what is the point of living till we're 90 if many of those years in our 90s are going to be pretty miserable? So I'm
Mm.
not suggesting that anybody should go out and smoke in order to die young. I mean, I'm not crazy. But I just think we get through our life in different ways. There are different things that bring pleasure to us. And also, I mean, just in the last few years, I've known people who have lived very healthy lifestyles, have been almost quite religious about living a healthy lifestyle, haven't smoked, have probably hardly drunk alcohol as well. They've died, out of the blue in their early 70s or mid 70s. And you think, they've lived largely blameless lives in terms of their lifestyle. The reality is, yes, you can look after your lifestyle and it may help you get into your 80s, maybe even into your 90s. But ultimately, it's Russian roulette. We simply don't know. We can't all live these perfect lives. And there's a reason why people talk about the average age. The average age that people are currently living to, I think, is something like 84. I'm not sure. But the reason you have an average age is because some people live longer and some people don't live as long. And just because you might die at 76 doesn't mean to say that you've lived a sinful life by smoking or drinking or eating too much of the wrong type of food. Maybe that's just, that's the way things are. We all live our lives in different ways. Many people die without warning. We don't know why.
Yeah, indeed. And that seems a very good point to start there to finish the interview on. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about this. There's obviously a lot into it as well with regards to civil liberties, just in general, and how those are being attacked. And obviously, smoking, you could argue, is part of that. Just finally, then, if people want to see your work with Forest, where can they go to?
We have a website which is forestonline.org, and that has all our responses to these various issues. And we post all our press releases on there as well. So it's forestonline.org.
Very cool. Simon Clark, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you on the 286 project. All the best with Forest and all the best with this campaign.
Thanks, Chris, and lovely to speak to you too.
Likewise, take care.